What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to this week's installment on the Lake Show, and I really appreciate you all making me a part of your day again. So last week I went over March Madness, and congratulations to the Florida Gators, even though I hate the Gators with a burning passion. They won March Madness. Congratulations to them. Last week I discussed the Duke Blue Devils and Houston ending of that kind of game in the Final Four. So obviously we all know what happened there. We know that Duke had an immaculate choke job that they put on display for the whole world to see. But that's neither here nor there. We got a couple good stories to talk about today. This might end up being a little shorter episode than usual, but nothing too major to worry about. And as you all know, I'm a Bucked Up ambassador, so use promo code SHOW32, get yourself 20% off any and all pre-workout orders at buckedup.com. And once again, I got to give all glory and all praise to the one true King, Jesus Christ, who allows me to do this every single day of my life. He gives me more peace and more happiness and more hope than anything I can possibly imagine in this world of ours that seems to be getting crazier by the day. So, with that being said, we're going to start off today with some college football news. Now, when it comes to NIL, I've been saying it for a long time that it would bring out issues, but I was also a big advocate for college football players to end up being paid, because I do think that at that point in time, if you want to talk about for the grand scheme of my whole life, college athletes in general, they sold jerseys with their names on it. They sold merchandise, they sold autographs, and they never got compensated for it. They were always in the college football, college basketball, whatever it may be, video games, and they never got paid for it. I was always big on paying college football athletes. I think that they deserve to be paid to some extent. I'm not saying that they deserve NFL contracts, but with NIL, that's becoming more apparent now. And the first domino to fall is now probably the biggest issue when it comes to NIL in general. And we're talking about Tennessee quarterback Nico Iamaleava. So Nico, he was a freshman last year, led Tennessee, a big part of Tennessee's run to the college football playoff before they got absolutely stomped by Ohio State in the first round. But Nico Iamaleava was set to make around $2.4 million from an NIL collective this upcoming season. Well, he ends up holding out of Tennessee's spring practices and spring games because he and his team are looking in the ballpark of around $4 million, which is, I think, around what Carson Beck is making at Miami. And here's the thing. Okay, so here's the issue with that. Do you really think Nico Iamaleava is a $4 million a year kind of quarterback? I don't think he is. If I remember correctly, in the game against Ohio State in the college football playoff, he went 10 of 31 for 100-some yards, no touchdowns, no picks, and really didn't amount to much when it comes to offensive capability against the Buckeyes. So you're telling me that that's a $4 million quarterback? I don't think so. But here's the bigger grand scheme of things is that Nick Saban was right. Nick Saban got out of this, the second he knew. Nick Saban just knew how players were going to be. He knew that this NIL collective for paying college players was dangerous to the game. Now, and he was kind of right in saying, all the things that he grew up to coach, all the things that he, wanted to coach and, getting young men ready for, life after football or life in the NFL or just being a life coach in general. A lot of that stuff, people aren't going to schools anymore because, they want to be part of the tradition. They want to be a part of the culture there. They want to be a part of something bigger. No, a lot of players nowadays are just looking for a bag. They're looking for their next, big payday. And Nico Iamaleava is probably the biggest name so far that we know about that is taking a stance like this. So Nico is, Josh Heupel, the Tennessee head coach, obviously, he wasn't thrilled about it, but they thought it was best. Him and Nico, Tennessee and Nico, they both parted ways. They are done. Nico Iamaleava is going to be hitting the transfer portal real soon. I believe it's this upcoming week. I believe it's next week where the transfer portal opens again, starting post recruiting and all that stuff. But when you look at this whole situation, I think it's sad just because Nico, while he wasn't a great quarterback last year, he was only a freshman and he's up and coming. I thought Nico Iamaleava I thought he was going to be a pretty decent quarterback over these next couple years. I'm not saying he would be an NFL prospect that would, rival like Peyton Manning or anything like that, but I think he still would have been a respectable quarterback in college football anyway. So when I look now, some teams that come to mind right now that Nico could possibly transfer to, you got the USC Trojans, you got Lincoln Riley out there, who's a quarterback whisperer. I would say there's also Notre Dame. They have a mix of quarterbacks right now that are gunning for that starting job. I think Nico would definitely shine above guys like CJ Carr. You got the UCLA Bruins, and again, some of this stuff I'm getting off ESPN, and UCLA is another team that strikes me, at least according to this article on ESPN. But there's another team I would say that would have an outside shot, and I think that would be either Alabama or or the Georgia Bulldogs. I think those two teams would be more than willing to try and go after Nico to bring him to their set program. But this is sad, really, just because I see how NIL has affected college football already, and it's only going to get worse. One quarterback holding out for a bigger NIL payday and a bigger NIL collective, there's more to come. I'm willing to bet that more of stories like this are going to happen. More players are going to be holding out because of an NIL dispute, and that's going to end up hindering their progress through their college career and their college life, rather than growing in maturity at one program and learning how to be the best, possible player and person you can be. Now all it is about money. I think this is going to be a big time hindrance to, these young athletes' growth for the future. So Nico Iamaleava holds out against Tennessee spring practices and spring games and will now hit the transfer portal. All right, next story we're going to get into. We got a little bit of a reunion happening in the AFC North in the NFL. Quarterback Joe Flacco is returning to the Browns on a one-year deal. And I believe, 1-year deal worth $4 million. And the contract can be worth up to $13 million with incentives. So here's my whole thing about this. I don't think the Browns should have ever moved off of Joe Flacco in the first place. A couple of years ago, he comes in straight off the couch and leads the Browns to the playoffs. They did get absolutely mollywopped by the Texans, but the Texans at that point in time were probably the hottest team in the NFL with a rookie CJ Stroud at the helm. But when you look at Cleveland, I think this is a good situation for Cleveland. Now, do I think this makes them Super Bowl contenders? No. But do I think they're much more mature and much, better at the quarterback position? Absolutely. Joe Flacco he's still a Super Bowl champion for the Baltimore Ravens from years ago. He's still a vet. He's still got some talent. He went to the Colts. I didn't think that was really a good fit for Joe Flacco, and he didn't necessarily play well. But when you look at Cleveland and their quarterback situation, they got Kenny Pickett and they got Deshaun Watson, and I can't think of who else is on roster right now for Cleveland. But when you bring in Joe Flacco, I think he's immediately going to challenge Deshaun Watson at this point for the starting role. That is if they don't get rid of Deshaun Watson. But at this point in time, if I'm the Cleveland Browns, I don't know why in general I'm holding on to Deshaun Watson. You were going to be paying him anyway. You might as well pay him when he's not on your team, because having him on the team is just going to splinter the team a little bit more, in my opinion. I don't understand this whole dynamic that you have to keep Deshaun Watson around because of this contract, because you were paying him no matter what. You might as well get rid of him, get some camaraderie back in that locker room, because I guarantee you, even though players will come out and defend, Deshaun Watson, because one, that's their teammate and that's their quarterback, I'm willing to bet that there are plenty of players in Cleveland's locker room that are like, please release this cat. Please get this cat out of the locker room. And that I wouldn't hold them against it whatsoever, because he hasn't played well at all since he's been a Houston Texan. But at this point, it seems like that was 5-6 years ago. It seems like that was a decade ago, and he is not even remotely close to the quarterback he was in that promising start to his career with Houston. And now, again, with his off the field issues, I'd say that would be reason enough to get rid of him. But bringing in Joe Flacco now, I think you have your set starting quarterback, at least for day one, if you're the Cleveland Browns. You could still draft Shedeur Sanders at number 2 in the NFL draft, but all signs now are pointing that they won't even take Abdul Carter. They're going to look deeper and probably more interested right now at Travis Hunter rather than Shedeur or Abdul Carter. We're going to find out eventually, but I like this move personally for Joe Flacco. I still think he has a decent amount left in the tank. I'm not saying he's going to go on a, legendary Super Bowl run like he did back in 2012, with the Baltimore Ravens, but I am saying that the Cleveland Browns are in a better position today at quarterback than they were yesterday with Deshaun Watson and Kenny Pickett on their team. All right, next, I'm going to give you another installment of Laco's list. I'm going to be giving you some of my top 5, position groups in the NFL draft this upcoming year. So I'm going to give you my top 5 quarterbacks. I'm going to give you my top 5 running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. I'm going to give you my top 5 of those certain position categories. And we're going to start off with quarterback position. My number 1 quarterback going into this draft, everybody can probably guess it because they know me so well, but I think it's obvious, and that's Cam Ward. 6'2", 219 out of Miami. I have him being my number 1 quarterback on the board. He has all the intangibles you want in a good quarterback. I talked about it before: leadership, arm angle, arm accuracy, arm strength, mobility. He's not Lamar Jackson mobile, but he is definitely mobile enough and can extend plays when, the pocket breaks down. And I think just in general, Mario Cristobal talked about it before, that he is the best leader that he's ever been around. And I think that is something that is definitely needed at the NFL level. If you don't have good leadership, then you can't galvanize a locker room. You cannot bring a team together. So Cam Ward is my number 1 quarterback this year in the draft. Okay, number 2 is going to surprise some people. And for me, number 2 is Ole Miss quarterback Jackson Dart. Now, a lot of people are going to say Shedeur's the more polished quarterback, but I like the fact that Jackson Dart has had to play so much football in the SEC. I like the fact that, he is a beautiful deep ball. He really does. He's about the average height of a quarterback, 6'2", 223. I personally like Jackson Dart more than I like Shedeur Sanders. So Jackson Dart would take my second spot. Personally, I have Shedeur Sanders, 6'2", 212 from Colorado. I have him as my 3rd best quarterback out of this draft. And I'm not saying that he's not going to be a top pick. Some people have Shedeur Sanders as the number one quarterback in the draft, but yet all signs are pointing that Cam Ward's going to go number one. But for me, I just go it based off of how I've watched them play. And I like Jackson Dart a little bit more than Shedeur Sanders. You can honestly interchange both of those. But just because of Shedeur Sanders, he does not have the arm strength of Jackson Dart. He does have the accuracy a little bit better. But again, it's based off of personal preference at this point. So I have Shedeur Sanders as my third best quarterback in this NFL draft upcoming in 2 weeks. My fourth best quarterback in this draft, I personally have Jalen Milroe. Now, I'm very worried Pittsburgh is going to take Jalen Milroe in the first round. I don't think Jalen Milroe is remotely close to a first-round caliber quarterback. He is a heck of an athlete. He is one heck of an athlete. But he does struggle from time to time with his throwing. But the way he runs the football at the quarterback position as an athlete strictly, is enough to put him in a top 4 position for me when it comes to the quarterbacks in this upcoming draft. So I have Jalen Milroe as my fourth best quarterback. And then my fifth best quarterback, I'm going to be honest and say Tyler Shuck from Louisville. I think Tyler Shuck is a very underrated prospect. When we talk about Tyler, he's a big quarterback compared to the other guys. He's 6'5", he's 219. He played fairly well when he was at Louisville. He had a quietly good career with the Cardinals. And, I just think for some reason he's going to go in the third round and then he's going to be a starter, kind of like what a Dak Prescott situation it was. Dak Prescott was not a first-round quarterback. He went in the third round, I believe, or the fourth or fifth round. He went in the later rounds and then ended up starting for the Dallas Cowboys. So for me personally, I think Tyler Shuck, I have him as my fifth best quarterback, but I also think he can definitely be a starter eventually in this league. I think he can have sort of a Dak Prescott situation happen to him. All right, now we're going to move on to running backs. My favorite running back in this draft, Ashton Jeanty. I don't think there's any rhyme or reason to think that there would be any other running back above Ashton Jeanty and what he was able to do this past year, nearly breaking Barry Sanders' rushing record in college football. He has everything you want: size, speed, athleticism. The fact that he can get hit and his balance is just off the charts crazy for me. When he's a running back, he can take hits and yet he can still stand upright. I think Ashton Jeanty is going to be a fantastic running back in the league. My second best running back in this draft, I have TreVeyon Henderson. And then at third, I have the other Ohio State running back, Quinshon Judkins. So TreVeyon Henderson, these guys have, they were a great 1-2 punch at Ohio State. You have Henderson, who's the more, elusive. He's faster. He has a better pass catcher out of the backfield. And then you got Judkins, who's a more strong and physical runner, but still has some blazing speed. I personally wouldn't mind having either one of them on my team. I think you can flip-flop them specifically based off of Judkins as more of a power back. He can still catch, but he's more of a power back. And then you have Henderson, who's more of a speedster, and he's more of a receiving kind of back. But either way, both of those two are interchangeable in my opinion, and both of them will honestly be pretty good players in the NFL. So that takes my 2 and 3 spots: TreVeyon Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. Whichever way you want to lean, I think both of them have pros. It doesn't really matter which one you go with. Me personally, I like Henderson a little bit more just because of the pass catching dynamic. And then you have Judkins at 3. My fourth best running back in this draft, personally, I have Omarion Hampton, the 6', 221-pound running back out of North Carolina. This dude is just so unbelievably fast and so unbelievably strong. He only ran a 4.46 at the combine, but he runs with such ferocity and such strength So I have Omarion Hampton as my fourth best running back. And number 5, I'm going to be honest, a lot of people would take like Caleb Johnson, Dylan Sampson, Jordan James, RJ Harvey, Damian Martinez. A lot of people would take those guys. And I think they're going to be fine running backs. Again, this is the deepest running back draft we've had in a long time. I think a lot of great running backs are coming out of this draft. My 5th best running back, though, is Cam Skattebo from Arizona State. He's 5'10", 219, but he does not play like a 5'10", 219 running back. He has unbelievable speed, strength, power. He can catch the football. He can throw the football. I think Cam Skattebo is going to end up on an NFL team, fairly early. I think he goes within the first 3 rounds of the NFL draft. I wouldn't mind having him on Pittsburgh at all. But personally, I watched what a lot of people are going to talk about his height and his weight. That proportion is not necessarily ideal for a running back position. But I'm just telling everybody, I watched Skattebo play against Texas in the college football playoff quarterfinal. Yeah, I watched him play against Texas. Texas could not stop him at all. A 5'10", 219-pound running back. And this was the, pinnacle of SEC football from Texas, and yet they still could not stop Cam Skattebo. So my 5th overall running back I have in this draft is, in fact, Cam Skattebo. Okay, I'll go quick with these. Well, I don't need to because we're almost done anyway. Okay, so for wide receivers, these ones are a little bit tougher, but me personally, just based off of who I've watched and who's most consistent and everything like that, I personally have my number 1 wide receiver on the board being Emeka Egbuka from Ohio State. A lot of people are going to say Tet McMillan or Matthew Golden, which I have both of them in my top 5. But when you look at just who has been one of the most consistent pass catchers for the past few years in college football, one of the best route runners in the past few years in college football. People forget, like, Emeka Egbuka was an absolute stud on this Ohio State team. Everybody, praises Jeremiah Smith because he's a freshman and probably going to be the second coming of Calvin Johnson. But when you look at Emeka Egbuka, he still had a phenomenal career at Ohio State. I am desperate to know how Brian Hartline is so good at recruiting. I really desperately want to know. I want to know what he tells these kids to come to Ohio State. It still makes me mad that Jeremiah Smith from the 305 did not go to the University of Miami. Instead, he went to Columbus to play for the Buckeyes. I want to know what Brian Hartline tells these wide receivers in order to get them to come to Ohio State, because Miami could use some of that. And a lot of other colleges would probably kill to have Brian Hartline on their staff. So Emeka Egbuka, when it comes to, his route running, his hands, his speed, I like all of it. And he's been, very consistent now the past couple years out of the shoe. So personally, I have Emeka Egbuka as my number 1 wide receiver in the NFL draft this year. My second favorite wide receiver in this draft is Matthew Golden, the 5'11", 190-pound wide receiver from Texas. I like his speed. I like his hands. I think he's going to be he ran a sub 4.3 40-yard dash at the combine. We already know he's got blazing speed. But I personally do think that he is going to be he can end up being a number 1 in the NFL, a number 1 on a team, but I think he'll start off playing the slot. I can see Matthew Golden being a very, very productive slot receiver, especially with sub 4.3 speed. Matthew Golden has a lot of upside in the NFL. So he takes my number 2 spot. Then I have Tet McMillan as my 3rd favorite wide receiver going into this draft. And, 6'4" frame, 219 pounds. I think Tet McMillan is going to be he's going to be a fine NFL player. My 3rd favorite wide receiver I have in this draft is Luther Burden from Missouri. 6 foot, 206 pounds. I think he's got a big frame. The size is, I guess, a little bit questionable, but not necessarily too much. But I personally like Luther Burden as my fourth best quarterback. And then my fifth favorite wide receiver, when you look at, everybody in this draft, it's a deep draft for wide receivers. And I'm going to throw a curveball to everybody. My fifth favorite wide receiver in this draft, Xavier Restrepo from the University of Miami. 5'10", 209 pounds. Yes, his 40 time was slow, but he does not play slow. You can look at the past couple years that Restrepo has been in at the University of Miami. Every single SEC defense that he ever went, people are going to talk about how he didn't play. He played in the ACC. He played a bunch of garbage teams. Well, I watched him play Florida at the beginning of the year, this past year, and I watched him torch Alabama a couple years ago. Even though Miami got bludgeoned to death against Alabama in 2021, I believe it was, to start off the season, Xavier Restrepo still played very well in that game. And now you fast forward throughout his career, when he plays SEC defenses, he's always open. He's just always open. One of the best pure route runners in the entirety of this draft coming up. I think Xavier Restrepo is going to be a fine wide receiver in the NFL, and I think he's going to be a great slot position for any team in the NFL. And just his pure route running ability and his catch radius and his catching in general I have him at the fifth best wide receiver in this draft. All right, now I'm going to finish off with talking about the tight ends. So personally, in this draft, and I'm going to go quick for you. So my first favorite tight end in this draft, honestly, is Tyler Warren from Penn State, just because he's a Swiss Army knife. You can line him up in the backfield. He can block. He can catch. He can run. I think he's just the ultimate Swiss Army knife when it comes to tight end. Like, you can line him up anywhere, and I think he'll be very productive in the NFL. Colston Loveland is my second favorite tight end, 6'6", 248. Obviously didn't really do a whole lot when it comes to the Michigan Wolverines. I mean, because Michigan has always been a power run team, so it doesn't surprise me that Colston Loveland didn't have, outlandish stats, but I think he's going to be a fine NFL player. My third favorite tight end, Elijah Arroyo, 6'5", 250 from Miami. The best part about Elijah Arroyo is he got better as the season progressed last year. If injuries didn't hinder him so much, from years prior, I think we would be... He took a while to get going early on in the college football season last year, but the more that the season went on, the better he got. If he started off hot this past year, we'd be talking about him possibly being one of the top draft picks, in the NFL draft, rather than a day two kind of guy. But I think Elijah Arroyo has all the intangibles you want to be a good tight end in this league. Number 4, I'm gonna go with Harold Fannin Jr. from Bowling Green. This tight end, he I believe he got the Triple Crown as a tight end, or he was up there. Tyler Warren won best tight. He won the Mackey Award for the best tight end, when in reality it should have went to this guy. He led the FBS in receptions and receiving yards in 2024. He had 117 receptions and 1,500 yards receiving. And yeah, they did not give this man the Mackey Award. Comparing it to Tyler Warren, Harold Fannin, maybe he didn't play for, Ohio State. He didn't play for Penn State. He didn't play for, college football blue blood. He just played for Bowling Green. But I think he's going to be a good NFL prospect. And then my final tight end that I like going into this NFL draft is Gunnar Helm from Texas. I think by a tight end, Helm, he broke Texas's single season records for catches and receptions by a tight end. So he has good hands. And personally, I watched him play a little bit against Arizona State, and I watched him play against Ohio State. He didn't play necessarily too bad against those teams. I think he's going to fall probably third or fourth round, but I think he can be a good NFL prospect. And we're going to take one quick look at the NBA real quick. And I want to talk about realistically one team that I find hysterical. So the playoffs are basically set. It's just talking about who's going to be in the play-in games. That's what's being set in stone right now. I want to talk about the Phoenix Suns real quick. The fact that they have Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, and Bradley Beal, and they were all healthy, and yet they could not catch the injury-riddled Dallas Mavericks. The Dallas Mavericks, despite losing Kyrie Irving and Anthony Davis to injury basically for the whole year, yet they clinched the 10 spot. They clinched a play-in berth. And yet the Suns, with a healthy KD, a healthy Devin Booker, and a healthy Bradley Beal, they fell 3 games behind the Dallas Mavericks. And again, this is because that the Suns, they have no sense of a bench whatsoever. I just find it hysterical that the injury-riddled Dallas Mavericks still, despite trading Luka Doncic, clawed their way and got into the play-in games, for the NBA playoffs. And the Phoenix Suns, with basically 3 all-stars on their team, with 3 superstars on their team, could not make even the play-in game, let alone the NBA playoffs. And that's going to wrap it up this week on The Lake Show, everyone. Again, I really appreciate you all making me a part of your day. Be sure to like, subscribe, share with your friends, leave some comments down below. I'm your host, Dominic Lako. God bless.
I love the chase and the hunt, and I set the pace when I'm running. I always take what I want and I always give it 100. Don't need a bank, no I'm funded. Play the game like it's nothing. I'm always thankful for something. Don't take for granted, stay humble. Now wake up, it's time to look at the enemy. Look in the mirror if he is no friend to me. It's not working out.